Greetings, I'm the man behind the mask, and I'd like to talk to you about hockey. Yes, let's talk about hockey, the show that journeys through the history of the sport of ice hockey from its disputed origins to the game we see today. Today, we continue our look back at the founding years of the NHL's original 6 hockey clubs, with the second of the 3 American teams to join the league in 1926, the New York Rangers.
Back in 1925, the New York Americans joined the NHL and set up shop in Madison Square Garden. When the Americans proved to be a greater success than expected, Madison Square Garden president Tex Rickard then went after a team of his own for the Garden, despite promising the Americans that they would be the only hockey team to play there. It wasn't long before Rickard was granted a franchise, which he originally planned to name the New York Giants. But by the time the franchise was granted in April of 1926, the name New York Rangers Professional Hockey Club became the team's official name. In fact, the origin of the name Rangers, as in Texas Rangers, is variously attributed to either Rickard himself or the New York press. With an NHL franchise now under his control, Rickard managed to get future legendary Toronto Maple Leafs owner Conn Smythe to assemble the team's personnel. However, Smythe would soon have a falling out with Rickard's hockey man, Colonel John S. Hammond, and was then fired as the Rangers manager-coach on the eve of the first season. Smythe was then replaced by Pacific Coast Hockey Association co-founder Lester Patrick, who kept all of the players Smythe had assembled. Once they took to the ice, this new team turned out to be a winner, claiming the American Division title in their first year. Though they would fall to the Boston Bruins in the semifinals of the playoffs that year, the team's early success led to the players becoming minor celebrities and fixtures in New York City's Roaring Twenties nightlife. It was also during this time, playing at the Garden on 48th Street, blocks away from Times Square, that the Rangers obtained their now famous nickname, the Broadway Blue Shirts. However, the Rangers would continue to build on their success in only their second season. Even though they would finish second in the American Division this year, the playoffs would be a different story. The Rangers would first defeat the Pittsburgh Pirates in a total goals series 6-4. Then the Boston Bruins fell to them 5-2 in a similar fashion, advancing New York to the Stanley Cup Finals for the first time. There, they would face the Montreal Maroons in a best-of-5 game series. After dropping Game 1 to the Maroons by a score of 2-0, Game 2 of the finals would set up one of the most memorable stories in Stanley Cup history. After New York's goaltender Laurent Chabot was struck in the eye by a hard shot fired by Nels Stewart, he was unable to continue, leaving the Rangers in need of a goaltender.
At the time, it was not common for teams to have a backup goaltender, and the opposing team's coach had to allow a substitute goaltender. However, the Maroons manager-coach Eddie Girard refused to give permission for the Rangers to use Alex Connell, the Ottawa Senators' star netminder who was in the stands, as well as minor leaguer Hugh McCormick. So, in anger, the Rangers manager-coach, 44-year-old Lester Patrick, decided to don the pads himself, while Odie Cleghorn, the then coach of the Pittsburgh Pirates, stood in for him as coach for the remainder of the game.
The Rangers then body blasted any Maroon who got near Patrick, limiting Montreal to 1 goal as the game headed into overtime, where Frank Boucher scored to win the game 2-1, with Patrick himself stopping 17 of 18 shots and becoming the oldest person to play in the Stanley Cup Finals. Following Game 2, the league gave permission for the Rangers to use Joe Miller from the New York Americans in goal. And though the Maroons would again blank them 2-0 in Game 3, the Rangers would take Games 4 and 5, becoming only the second American team to win the Cup and the first NHL American team to do so. Entering the 1928-29 season in defense of their newfound title, the Rangers kept their edge from the previous year, climbing their way past their hometown rivals, the New York Americans, and then the Toronto Maple Leafs to land back in the Stanley Cup Finals for a second consecutive year. However, this time around, New York would not be sipping champagne, as the Boston Bruins swept them for the 1929 Stanley Cup. In the 2 years following their loss to Boston, the Rangers would drop down to third in their division and bow out in the semifinals of the playoffs both times. In the 1931-32 season, however, they were back on top, winning the American Division and defeating the Canadiens 3-1 in the semifinals to advance to the 1932 Stanley Cup Finals against Toronto. Like the 1929 Finals, though, the Rangers would be swept by their opponents and sent home to regroup for the next season. And regroup they did, as the 1932-33 season culminated in a rematch with the Maple Leafs for the Stanley Cup. This time around, the Rangers' breadline of Frank Boucher centering Bill and Bun Cook would exact revenge on the Leafs' kid line of Busher Jackson, Joe Primo, and Charlie Conacher, as New York bested Toronto 3-1 for their club's second cup title in their short 7-year history.
For the next 3 seasons, though, the Rangers would barely scrape an above 500 record in the regular season, with their playoff record not much better. In fact, the only real bright spot for the club was Frank Boucher winning his 7th Lady Byng trophy in 8 years, which prompted the league to let him keep the trophy, while Lady Byng donated another trophy for the league to use.
After failing to make the playoffs for the first time ever in 1935-36, things seemed to go downhill a bit more as the Rangers' record dropped below 500 for the first time in 1936-37. Luckily for them, though, this turned out to be just good enough to make the playoffs that year. Despite the mediocrity of the regular season and the 3 seasons prior, the Rangers came alive for the 1937 playoffs, sweeping Toronto in the quarterfinals and then the Montreal Maroons in the semifinals to advance to the Stanley Cup Finals to face the defending champions, the Detroit Red Wings. In Game 1, the Rangers stuck it hard to the defending champs, beating them 5-1. But Detroit would respond in kind when they took Game 2 by a score of 4-2. After that, New York would manage to push Detroit to the brink by winning Game 3, but the Red Wings would then shut the Rangers out in Games 4 and 5 to repeat as Stanley Cup champions.
Following this unbelievable run to the finals, New York's regular season numbers would see dramatic improvement as they finished second in the American Division in 1938, and when the division system for the NHL was removed due to the shrinking number of teams in the league following that, the Rangers finished second in the league in 1939. But despite these improved regular season finishes, the Rangers' playoffs were far from what one would call impressive or lengthy, as they lost back-to-back opening matchups during these 2 seasons.
Before starting the 1939-40 season, manager-coach Lester Patrick would step down from his coaching position and hire former Rangers great Frank Boucher to take his place. In Boucher's first season as coach, the Rangers would finish second in the league with a 27-11-10 record, earning them a bye into the semifinals of the playoffs, where they were matched up against the defending champion and first overall team in the league, the Boston Bruins. But the Rangers would stun the Bruins in 6 games, outscoring them 14-8 to head to the Stanley Cup Finals to play the Toronto Maple Leafs. In Game 1, the Rangers would need overtime to gain a 1-0 series lead, but in Game 2, they would win more easily with a 6-2 victory. Toronto would then take the next 2 games to tie the series at 2, before New York took Game 5 in overtime. In Game 6, the Rangers would continue to have to work hard for the puck as the game once again headed into overtime, where the NHL's leading goal scorer Brian Hextall netted the goal that clinched the Cup for New York 2 minutes in. In the years following their 1940 title run, the Rangers would nearly collapse, losing games by as much as 15-0 and coming a hair away from being forced to fold the club altogether. And though their 54-year Stanley Cup drought would become an NHL record, the Rangers have persevered and are today one of the top contenders to add another Stanley Cup title to their long and established history.